let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. This much we pledge and more. To those old allies whose cultural and spiritual origins we share, we pledge the loyalty of faithful friends. United, there is little we cannot do in a host of cooperative ventures. Divided, there is little we can do, for we dare not meet a powerful challenge at odds and split asunder. To those new states whom we welcome to the ranks of the free, we pledge our word that one form of colonial control shall not have passed away, merely to be replaced by a far more iron tyranny. We shall not always expect to find them supporting our view, but we shall always hope to find them strongly supporting their own freedom, and to remember that in the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside. To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. To our sister republics south of our border, we offer a special pledge to convert our good words into good deeds, in a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free government in casting off the chains of poverty. But this peaceful revolution of hope cannot become the prey of hostile powers. Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. To that World Assembly of Sovereign States, the United Nations, our last best hope, in an age where the instruments of war have far outpaced the instruments of peace, we renew our pledge of support to prevent it from becoming merely a forum for invective, to strengthen its shield of the new and the weak, and to enlarge the area in which its grit may run. Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations. Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burden and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved. All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion, which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standard of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
University. And I want to welcome all of you here today, our panelists, our participants. I want to thank our support staff, Brandon and Rachel, for everything that you've done to make this happen. I appreciate all of you being here today. And I want to introduce to you Dr. H. Eric Shockman, Professor of Politics and International Relations, Humanities Coordinator in the College of Liberal Arts, and Coordinator of the Center for Leadership, Equity, and Diversity. Eric is also the author of several books and many articles on leadership and politics in California on a national level and international. And I wanted to say just a word about the Center for Leadership and Equity and Diversity that Eric heads. As a linchpin to connect, engage, educate, and empower all the rich elements of our campus tapestry, Woodbury University's Center for Leadership, Diversity, and Equity is grounded in the values of social justice, building strong alliances, and visionary up-and-coming leaders, catalyzing positive change. Eric, we appreciate your leadership of the center.
Thank you, Dean Ellis. And I also would like to welcome everybody. Thank you again for spending part of Saturday afternoon with us or whatever time zone you're in. We are very honored to be here with you. We've assembled a distinguished panel. This topic is a very important topic for public discourse and conversation. I'd like to just for a moment tell you it's also this forum is being co-hosted by the Department of Public Safety Administration at Woodbury University. Relatively new department. We have about 35, 40 undergraduate students. The department gives a BS degree. We're seeing our first graduates coming through this spring, and they will be duly minted and put into the field or go on to higher education graduate studies. But the public administration the major is a critical linchpin for us in Woodbury because we have a novel way to sort of approach this. It's interdisciplinary, it's very practical. It really takes students from a sort of beginning formula of understanding both soft skills in community policing to more hard skills in what policing is about. So I'm very honored to coordinate the program and to see many of our students really learning from practitioners who we integrated, including Sergeant Jackson, who's on this panel. So with that, let me introduce our moderator, who it's a real pleasure to do so, Elizabeth Corrino Diaz. She is a product of Woodbury University. She got her master's degree in organizational leadership. She is a shining star who continues to blossom along the way. Chief Thomas and I agree she is the best hire that USC has ever had in the community relations area of the Department of Public Safety at USC. She really bonds with the students, bonds with the community, bonds with the officers. Elizabeth is also pursuing her PhD in the School of Public Policy at USC, and is really an up-and-coming both scholar, brilliant leader, and she will be taking the moderation side of today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Elizabeth, and again, welcome to all our panelists.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Shockman, and good afternoon, everyone that is joining us both on the audience side and on the panel side, who I will be happy to introduce. As can be expected in the virtual world, we are running into just a tiny bit of technical difficulty, so we're running a little bit behind on admitting one of our panelists, and I hope that he can join us fairly soon, but he is definitely trying on his end to get in. So I will begin by just doing a very brief introduction of our panelists. As a lot of people may know, in law enforcement, there's look like, and also to introduce us to their current in terms of geographical areas. We have some that are from Redmond, we have some in Glendale, we have some in LAPD. We also have campus law enforcement and municipal law enforcement. So I just kind of wanted them to explain where they're joining us from. So I will begin with Deputy Chief Imada Tingarides, who works at the Los Angeles Police Department, and she was actually born and raised in my hometown of Watts and South LA. Overall, incredible person. She joined the LAPD in 1995 and was actually inspired to join the department after the 1992 civil unrest as a result of the Rodney King trial. She was actually recently promoted to the rank of deputy chief earlier this year, and I was kind of hoping that maybe Chief Tingarides, if you wouldn't mind, you could give us a little bit more background on your career, your current assignment, and of course, if you could tell us a little bit more about CSP.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue, especially now at this juncture in what's occurring across this country. So I appreciate the other panelists. Woodbury, thank you so much for having this critical conversation. Like Elizabeth said, I did join LAPD in 1995. And actually when I came on, Chief Thomas, who's also on this panel, was on the LAPD as well. I recently was promoted to Deputy Chief to oversee the Community Safety Partnership Program, which began in 2011. And it is a relationship-based policing model centered on building relationships by understanding the culture of the communities and the history of the communities, and then aligning that understanding and working alongside our nonprofit organizations, our schools, to make change and address some of the mistrust in the community. Like Liz said, I came on in 1995 after the 1992 civil unrest with Rodney King. That really tugged at me. I grew up in South Los Angeles. I come from a family of service, and I made the decision to come back and serve my community and do it with one of the finest law enforcement agencies in the country. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the dialogue and continuing this discussion on how we can make change.
Thank you, Chief. Now I will introduce Chief Thomas, who is also my boss. I've had the privilege of working for him for the last 9 years. And Chief Thomas has been with the Department of Public Safety for I believe 13 years now. And he actually came to us from the Los Angeles Police Department as well, where he retired as a lieutenant in chief. I could probably spend the remaining 2 hours just talking about a lot of what you shared in reference to your background in your career. But if you wouldn't mind maybe giving us a little bit more background on your career and also the department that you're currently leading now.
First, let me unmute myself. That's probably the first thing I need to do. But I will echo what my friend Imada Tingariti said. Thank you, Woodbury, for putting on this very topical discussion and dialogue. It is truly one of those times in not only policing history, but American history that we're at a critical juncture that I truly believe that gives us a great opportunity to go in a better direction. My career started, as was mentioned, with the Los Angeles Police Department. I joined in 1984, and it seems like just the Stone Age in American policing, how things were done. When I look at the diversity and look at the things that were going on, and the changes that have occurred in that time. But I began in 1984, served on Los Angeles Police Department. Actually, I never left because I'm still a level 1 reserve with LAPD. So my total time in law enforcement next month will be 36 years. So I've seen a lot in that time. I made the conscious decision to take on a different type of challenge once I retired from LAPD in 2006. And despite the fact that the bulk of my career was spent at LAPD, there was a period between where when I left LAPD, my first campus policing job was at an HBCU, the University of District of Columbia, where I served all of 2006. And then I came to USC at the end of 2006. And in that time, I started off as a captain, promoted to assistant chief, and I've now been the chief at USC Department of Public Safety now for 8 years in January. So it's been a great career. I kind of have my feet in both worlds, the municipal world, campus policing world. But one thing I never left was the community. And I think the thing that me, Imada, and Elizabeth have is we're all South Central natives. We grew up in there. We have strong ties there, family still there. So the community piece to what we bring to law enforcement, I think is critical. And not only critical from the perspective of South Central natives, but just being a part of those marginalized groups that I think have to be, those relationships have to be pulled together. So I'll stop right there. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind words. And I'm pleased and honored to be a part of this.
Thank you so much for being a part of it. And I'm gonna bookmark one thing. I know you said you started your career in 1984. So I know that the civil unrest that inspired Chief Tingarides to join the department, you were actually out there working. So after I have the honor of introducing Sergeant Jackson and let him introduce his department a little bit, I'd be very curious to hear, what are some of the parallels that perhaps you've experienced now over your 35-year career with LAPD in 1992 and now currently in 2020 with some of the issues that are going on nationwide. So I will definitely bookmark that topic. But for now, I will introduce Sergeant Victor Jackson, who I've known for not quite as long as I've had the honor of knowing Chief Tingarides and Chief Thomas, but we have met through Woodbury. We're both products of Woodbury. And he is currently working for the Glendale Police Department. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Sergeant Jackson, but I believe you started in 2005. You've since promoted, obviously, to the rank of sergeant, and you've worked as a crisis negotiator in the department's SWAT team, and you currently work for the training program, which I anticipate some of the questions, please.
Started and they let me come on anyway, and I was really lucky that I got to a department at a time when there was we had a community that was we had a lot of immigrants. We have a large Armenian community, and that community didn't have the most trust for law enforcement necessarily because of things that happened before they came to the United States in some cases. And because of that, I think that we have had to adapt and prepare for some of the things that other departments are dealing with now. We've been kind of dealing with those things early. So through my career, besides working patrol, I've had the opportunity to be a background investigator and hire a lot of officers and civilian and sworn positions, and be a field training officer and a burglary detective. And I was a drill instructor at the academy for a period of time right before I promoted. And now in this position, when I was given the honor of being the field operations sergeant for the Glendale Police Department, I was tasked with updating our training. Where do we need to go? What's the future going to be for training? And how can we get our officers, make sure we're on the cutting edge? We want to be a department where people look at and say, what are they doing over there at Glendale? And how can we get our department there? And I was given an opportunity to do that. And we've had pretty good success. We have a very pro police city. And again, that was a little bit of a change from where we had to build that trust with the community. And I think we've done that. And I think that some of the civil unrest that has been around the country recently, the response that we've gotten has been a little bit different. And I think some of that's because of the groundwork that we did. So I'm really proud to be a part of that. And then eventually, at some point during my career, I went and got my BA and then my master's at Woodbury. And then at some point, for some reason, Dr. Shockman was like, hey, as soon as I got my master's, all of a sudden he just opens doors, pushes me through them, whether I want to go through or not. And this panel is another example of that. And I appreciate you having me today.
Thank you for joining us. And also, I should have given this disclaimer earlier on. I'll give it now. Again, one of the things coming with the virtual world, right, and the ability to be able to do these things from home, that I've had to deal with is I have two incredibly loving and absolutely gorgeous mastiffs, but they are also very vocal. So if you hear what sounds like giant dogs barking in the background, it's just giant dogs barking in the background. So I apologize ahead of time to anyone who may be joining us. But Chief, again, as we wait for some of these questions to come in, I kind of wanted to go back to what we just mentioned earlier during your introduction, and just kind of talk about maybe what your experience was, both as a police officer and just as a person and a resident of South LA in 1992, and what, if any, parallels you see now.
Well, first off, one of my biggest concerns when I joined LAPD in 1984, because people were still talking about, believe it or not, the 1965 riots, and in my mind, I was always subconsciously dealing with what would I do if there was another civil unrest, and in the back of my mind, I was hoping that never happened, because that's where I grew up, and I also understood the frustrations and the anger and the sense of hopelessness that people in South LA felt. So I felt, that would be really a trying time for me. And lo and behold, I'm working narcotics at that time. And I recall the first night of the riots, ironically, they pulled all of the Black and Latinx officers that were working narcotics into one room. And I thought, what the heck is this about? But what it was they sent us out as scouts. So we actually went out, to kind of do situation assessments of what was going on and report back. So I actually got a chance to see it in a very personal way. People angry and destroying property, which I understood. So I got a chance to see it firsthand. But it really was painful. And then after probably a day or so, the department said, enough of that. Your assessments are pretty much the same. Get in uniform and go out there and help protect the city. I think the thing that was probably the most hurtful was hearing some of my peers and some of the comments that they would make about South LA residents. That was very hard. I had to really bottle up my anger at times, because that was where I grew up. I was looking at, places that I had fond memories of go up in flames. I heard people, comments about people oftentimes that I knew, so it was a very painful time. But when I flash forward to today and the comparatives, I don't really see too many comparisons. I really don't. I see and sense the anger. I understand it's all coming from the same place as it was in 92. But that part is a little concerning, because I don't see where, I know law enforcement has made some progress. It's light years better than it was in 84 and 92 and even 5 and 10 years ago. It's light years. But the institutional issues that permeate society, that also permeate law enforcement, still have not been addressed. So that's where we're back at. So there are some comparisons, but this is a lot more intense. This is a lot more global. And I think this is, as I said before, this is a landmark moment, not just for law enforcement, but for society, because we're talking about institutional racism. And yeah, law enforcement has the same issues of institutional racism as does medicine, as does education, as does every part of American society. So I think we're at a point where either we're going to deal with and address these issues, but it cannot be all on the burden of law enforcement.
I wanted to add, I couldn't agree with you more, Chief. And something that you just said that, and I'm sure Victor will feel the same. You mentioned how you felt hurt in hearing some things that were being said, even by other officers about the community and just about Blacks destroying their own community. And I'm thinking now about some of the tensions internally that are going on with officers of color who can relate to the pain and the anger of the Black community, and then being forced to feel like they have to take a side and explain to other officers why there's anger, why there's hurt, and why the community's having this response, and then feeling like they have to justify their actions to the community that looks like them. And when you said a lot has changed, but a lot hasn't changed. That's just a parallel between then and now that still exists, So very interesting to hear you give that perspective and think about the officers of color now who are finding themselves stuck in the middle, knowing that they joined law enforcement to make a difference in their community and build those relationships and show the community that we do care and we're not out to hurt everybody, but at the same time, understanding the fear, like me as a parent with a Black son and having those discussions about him wearing a hoodie or being respectful when he gets pulled over, or having to explain to him why he's hurting and listen to him. So it's definitely challenging times and a lot of similarities as it relates to the emotional and spiritual response of what's going on.
And I do think that for Black officers, it is a very stressful time, because, as you mentioned, Imada, it doesn't stop when we take the uniform off. It continues not only in how we have to behave, but how we have to raise our children. But also we're caught sometimes between the dynamics of the workplace, our families, the community. I joined law enforcement like probably Victor and you, Imada, and you, Elizabeth, because we saw that was an important vehicle by which you could make a difference in your community. My path was, I grew up in South LA. I went to UCLA, and then I joined LAPD. But at the same time, there was that part of me that never left the community, just like today. I always wandered back, and even USC, that's still in the heart of South LA. It's always tugged back at me that there's more I can do, but there's a cost. There is often a cost for Black officers. And I think our story doesn't get told nearly enough. I think we're an afterthought, so. But I'm curious to hear how Victor feels about some of this. So Victor?
Yeah, I come from a perspective of being the son of a deputy sheriff. My dad was a deputy sheriff for 34 years, retired as the rank of sergeant for the sheriff's department. And so I come from a home that is pro law enforcement and a family that is pro law enforcement. and a mom that had to worry about her husband for 34 years and now worries about her son, right? So I certainly can understand. I got to go to work, and I'm going to be gone for a few days, and take care of things around here. I'll call you guys and give you guys updates, and I'll see you in a while. And not knowing when he was going to come back, and even as as however old I was at that time, not having any fears that he wouldn't come back, but watching TV and seeing there was some serious stuff going on out there. So that is absolutely part of the reason that I'm here, and part of the reason that I love the responsibility that my department has given me to be involved with the training and changing how we are perceived, because I certainly have looked at law enforcement from the positives and the negatives. Like, what can we do? I tend to look at it at what can we do better? There are other things we can do better, absolutely. And if we kind of all are working in that same direction, that's going to be the way we need to go in the future, and that's going to set the make sure the community, the expectations of the community are met. We're at right now, where some people in my department want to talk about it, and they'll come to my office and talk about these things, and some people absolutely do not want to talk about it, and they go the other way if rather than come and speak to me or speak to some other officers about that. And I respect that, but again, I'm always available to discuss these things, and I'm always looking at what are the things we can do forward from the community side, me as a member of the community, and from the law enforcement side, me as a member of law enforcement.
And I understand that I come from a very pro law enforcement family. I think that's very important for us to acknowledge. In my position, Chief Thomas has trusted me with, meeting with a lot of our community stakeholders. And one of the things that I've learned is, whenever I start my speeches, I start with, let me be honest and say that I am pro law enforcement. I've worked alongside law enforcement for almost a decade now. I married a police officer in a police academy where 100 of our 300 guests were police officers, right? So it's so important for us to know, right, that we really need to welcome this diversity of thought and make sure that we're surrounding ourselves with people who may not necessarily agree with us and may not necessarily think like us, because only then can we really understand how is our profession affecting those people that we serve. So Sergeant Jackson, I just had to really give you kudos for really beginning your speech that way, because I think that's something very important for us to acknowledge.
Yeah, and if I can just jump back in with another quick thing, I think that, again, with the using a foundation of where can we get better, even being pro law enforcement, I can still identify problems, and I'm okay with that. And I remember one day in the report writing room at the station, an officer, a partner of mine, came to me and said, have you ever had a negative contact with a police officer before you were a police officer? And I was like, of course. And he was shocked. I've had 2 instances that I would describe as bad, really bad, right? And one of those is not the time that I was pulled over and a friend of mine in high school, we were thought to be suspects and laid out in the concrete and guns at our heads and all that. The officers are actually respectful after the fact when they realize who we were. I don't even count that, right? But that does not make me anti-law enforcement. That makes me want to be part of the change, and that's why I'm here. And as a instructor at Woodbury, I'm glad to say that I have a classroom full of people that are also want to be part of positive change. I have at my police department, I'm in charge of the academy recruits and the new officers. They all want to be part of change and progress and moving forward. And I think that law enforcement, the future of law enforcement, is in a really positive place, and I'm happy to be a part of that.
And thank you. And I appreciate you bringing that up as well, because I know when Dr. Shockman asked me to be a part of this, and he said we have students who are looking forward to becoming police officers or joining law enforcement in the future. They would really like to listen and be a part of this conversation. And I really got stuck on, wow, there's still people who want to be police officers, right? Because he reached out to me in that time, like June, it was rough. Like, even just as people in this field, it was rough, and it didn't occur to me until then, like, wow, there's still people who still want to be police officers, and I have to say that in and of itself is so encouraging. It's encouraging because on my end, being married to someone who's currently assigned to patrol, those couple of weeks were hard for my own reasons, right? They were hard on everyone for different reasons. For me, those were difficult. So to anyone out there in the audience that joining us as a student and that wants to be police officers, I just want you to know that as much as I'm sure you're inspired by these chiefs, I can guarantee you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Chief Tingariti, Chief Thomas, and Sergeant Jackson, that they too are inspired by the mere fact that they know that there's still, a younger generation that still, for whatever reason, wants to be a part of this field. And Chief Tingariti, I see you nodding in agreement. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I think there's so much packed into this discussion, and it's not all rosy, and there's some serious things that we do need to fix. And I love that Victor said he's seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and part of that is training. And I am so ecstatic about the fact that there still is interest in people that just have that compassion and empathy, that want to serve and be part of the solution. And I think if we start centering the discussion around culture and history, which I know Chief Thomas is a big advocate for, and training, those three things, culture, history, and training. But I want to throw a fourth thing in there, truth and reconciliation. Understanding the hurt and the pain and the wrongs, and getting some reconciliation with that, so that we can sit down at the table and be willing to have these discussions and move forward. And I think when you look at these recent critical incidents and officer-involved shootings, a lot of it goes back to training. And you have some law enforcement agencies saying, well, we wouldn't have done a pedestrian stop like that. We would have handcuffed him right away, or we would have utilized our de-escalation, and we would have had less lethal there, and we would have had time and distance in between us and this person or that person. It's safe to say that what happened to George Floyd is absolutely tragic and should not have happened. And I saw a question on there about media and what that looked like and how that played out. And so at the baseline of all this, it's training and the truth and reconciliation, and then listening and having that communication. If the younger people and the people that are listening today still want to serve and take on this career, I think it's key that they understand that this has to be about the community, and not just getting that badge and gun and saying, I'm a cop now. But at the core of it all has to be about understanding those communities, addressing the crime, but doing it with empathy and understanding, and doing it constitutionally.
So I want to bookmark a few things, because I know you definitely touched on the training piece. So I want to come back to that, but we do have a question that you touched on, and please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think it's from Carrie. And this question is for the panel. Do you think the media played a role in the increased tension between law enforcement and the communities of color?
Let me respond to that. Well, first of all, you got to look at the media in the context that the media operates. American media is driven by profits. It's an institution that, it's governed by ratings, be it the print, you got to sell papers, be it television, you got to get ratings. And I do think that, as long as, and I'll go to the roots of the problem of where the function of media in America. And I think it serves a great purpose in a democracy, because it is a primary form of educating the populace about what's going on. But I think as long as it's driven by profit and profit motives, it's going to rely heavily on what is sensational and what draws people in, be it good, bad, or indifferent. I think we have to get out of the mindset that the media is anything other than a business. It is a business. And as long as it's driven by business priorities, which is profit, it's profitable to show people, it's profitable to show anything that's salacious as police and the public at odds. And if it's continuing, you got continual ratings. So I think we hold the media to a standard that they're this bastion of integrity and this bastion of goodwill, but oftentimes it's not. And that's where I think the importance of us telling our stories, you know, even outside of the media, because it has painted most agencies as these racist institutions that can't get it right. And I'm here to tell you, after 36 years, and most of that being in or associated with the Los Angeles Police Department, it has evolved, but you don't hear that. You don't hear the stories of, you know, for instance, and I'll put you on the spot, the work that you've done, Imada, in the housing developments in Watts and the lives that have been saved, where when I was working gangs, we didn't even go into the projects without a helicopter and letting everybody know. And for many years, you didn't even have homicides there. And it was to the good work. But did that work ever get any exposure from the media other than in small snippets? But look, flash forward to what we're seeing post George Floyd. And I'm not saying this should not be covered. Please don't hear and think that's it. But I do think that when you look at the media, you got to look at the media in the context of it being a business, and it's driven by profit motives.
Chief Tinkeridis or Sergeant Jackson, did you have anything to add to that question?
Go ahead, Chief.
She's looking for her mute button. It happens to all.
Oh, there we go. There we go. It's a great question. And I think something to touch on too is body-worn video and transparency. And the fact that law enforcement, like Chief Thomas said, has constantly evolved and changed. And the fact now, I can remember when Chief Charlie Beck was on the LAPD and we got the body-worn videos. One of the things he said was, is America ready for this to come into their living rooms? Much like the Vietnam War when they started televising that. Was the country ready to see some of the gruesomeness and conflict in their living rooms? And when you have media, the social media, and then you have law enforcement that has body-worn cameras, the LAPD puts out an officer-involved shooting within 45 days. We call it a critical incident review. And we do our best to tell the story based upon that body-worn video. And even when we do that, there's accusations that we've doctored the video, or we changed the video, or we skewed the video to only show what we want to see. And so when Chief Thomas talks about the media being a business, I couldn't agree more. That goes back to everybody having a responsibility and a role to decreasing tensions in the community. And the media needs to be held accountable. It should be part of the solution to addressing that in the community. So I do feel like it has played a role. I feel like it hasn't been completely transparent. I feel too that they've skewed the stories that they want to tell. And in the end, the people that hurt is the community.
Yeah, when I talk to our new officers about the media, I explained to them that today, if they want to make us a story about the cops doing something great, they'll have a story about the cops doing great. If they believe they'll get higher ratings by the cop doing something they shouldn't have done, that's the story that they'll put out. So it's up to us to be consistent with our work style and to make sure that we are not putting out a product that if someone's looking at it, it looks negative or it is perceived as negative, and without us having a piece of that story. And that's, I think, where the media sometimes takes fault, where something happens, they put out the story. Unfortunately, they don't put the perspective of us, which is, in some cases, we are handicapped by the fact that we cannot put out the video immediately. download it, upload it on YouTube. There it is, world have it. We can't. There are legal ramifications to that, so we can't always do that. But that's what the public wants. And if the media doesn't put that information out there, that's when they think that we're not being transparent. Also, putting that video out too quickly can impede an investigation. And now we are behind the 8 ball, if you will, trying to find the suspect. We know who the suspect is. We know if we put that video out, the suspect will know we know who he is, and we may have a lead on him, and we want to work on the case. And so even doing our best to solve this crime in a timely manner and working for the benefit of the community, if members of the community, or in this case, members of the media, decide that we are not being transparent and try to get a statement from the department said they will not release the video immediately. Well, there is also a reason behind that, right? But if they don't tell that full story, that can lead to more tension than it needs to be for what the situation requires.
Thank you, and thank you, Carrie, so much for your question. I know we still have the bookmark on training. I haven't forgotten about the bookmark, but we are now joined by Chief Lowe, who had some technical difficulties initially, so I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce him. He's been a dear friend of mine for a few years now. We actually met through an executive leadership training at USC. And Chief Lowe is now with the Redmond Police Department as chief, but he served for 26 years with the Santa Monica Police Department. He's graduated the FBI National Academy, the Safe Communities Institute at USC, and has received a number of other certifications. He did definitely want me to include the fact that he is an avid Lakers fan and Dodgers fan. That was important to him. So even though he's left us for Redmond, his heart is still very much here in LA. So Chief Lowe, as I did with the rest of our wonderful panelists, if you wouldn't mind maybe giving us a little bit more background on your career, maybe some of the assignments you've worked, and the geographical area where you're leading now.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, my heart is very much still in Los Angeles and rooting for the Dodgers tonight to continue. But as you pointed out in my bio, I spent the vast majority of my law enforcement career, in Southern California, in Santa Monica. I too am a product of South Central Los Angeles. That's where I grew up and was born. My story is a little bit different. I appreciate Sergeant Jackson's perspective and yours from coming from a pro-law enforcement family. Not that my family was anti-law enforcement, but I was born to a single mom who came from the Deep South and participated in some of the civil rights activities. So clearly the police weren't, first and foremost in her mind. And so when I decided on that particular career path, let's just say it was a very interesting conversation in the Lowe household. But she supported, me in that decision, moving forward. Now I find myself having the opportunity to lead the Redmond Police Department up in the state of Washington. And it's very different up there. Folks will recognize Redmond as home of Microsoft. So very much a tech-driven community, and a lot of similarities and comparisons to Santa Monica. And as we watched the news these last couple of months with the civil unrest and the First Amendment protests,
I'm not sure if it's just me. On my end, Chief Lowe froze.
the time is right now for law enforcement leadership to make those changes that the community is asking for, and to get us to where we need to be.
And Chief Lowe, I apologize. We lost you for maybe 10 seconds as you were talking a little bit more about the community up in Redmond, but I believe it was yesterday as Chief Thomas and I were kind of preparing for today. We both were very interested in maybe some of your experiences this summer, particularly as they relate to the protests, given that you are so close to Seattle, and Seattle's experience over the summer was a little bit different that some of the things that we experienced, and some of the different from some of the things that the rest of the country experienced. So maybe if you could just debrief us on some of your experiences this summer, we definitely appreciate it.
Sure. So as I said, Seattle, there's a bridge and some water that separates Redmond from Seattle. So my experiences were different. However, much like in California, there is mutual aid. So I did have officers initially on the front lines in Seattle on the 31st when things kind of blew up. And it was a very unique experience because, politics, unfortunately, are playing a very significant role in some of this conversation. And unfortunately, sometimes the voice of the politicians is a bit louder than that of the community, and it needs to be the other way around. The community's voice needs to be heard a bit more prominently, by politicians, by police executives. In Redmond, particularly, we too had protests, but nothing like in Seattle. I was very fortunate that all of our protests were peaceful. But just experiencing that in the region and watching what was occurring, down in Southern California, there's lessons to be learned, for both of us, and then even for things that occurred across the country, the things that happened in Chicago and their Miracle Mile, in Minneapolis and other places around the country. So my experiences, like I said, I would consider them C plus. Seattle was, off the charts. They were definitely A plus with what they were and still are dealing with.
Thank you, Chief. And one of the first questions that we received that Chief Tingariti, Sergeant Jackson, and Chief Thomas all touched on was the idea of the media. And one of our audience members wanted to know if you think that the media played a role in the increased tension between law enforcement and the communities of color. And our panelists gave great answers and shared their perspectives. But I was wondering if maybe you may have something to add to that.
Yeah, just very briefly, I was able to hear my fellow panelists' positions, and I agree 100%. The only thing that I would add to that is I think, especially as a chief and in law enforcement, I think we could do a better job of interacting with the media, because as we know, and as Chief Thomas pointed out, it's ratings driven, and they're going to run the story. My position on it is I would much rather get out front and help drive the bus, even if it's the fact, as Sergeant Jackson pointed out, we may not be able to release specific information about a particular case because it could jeopardize that or let the suspect know that we know who they are. But I think we sometimes don't do ourselves any favors by not getting out in front and even saying that, because it's been my experience that even if you get out in front and say, I won't say nothing, but at least if you explain why you can't release more details, the better news outlets will give you equal time, or they will at least put that perspective out there. Because if not, then they're going to find the person. They're going to find that community member. They're going to find that neighbor. They're going to find that person that just wants to say whatever, because it's going to drive their story. So I think we could do a better job in that aspect.
So I wanted to pivot to another question. I definitely want to get to the training piece, but I think something very important, and I am biased, I do work community affairs, so I'll start with that. But I'm very curious to know, given that you all work for different departments, I'm very curious to know, how does your department build trust with the community?
That sounds like a Chief Thomas question right off the bat.
You know what? I'll take it, because I think actually when I met Imada, you were working community relations or media relations, right?
I worked community relations section for a few years in actually was at community relations section before I was selected to oversee the CSP. So
Okay, yeah. I thought way back in the day when we were on the 6th floor, you were working community relations or something like that.
yeah, I was.
Yeah, so yeah, community relations is very, very important, and I think where we have gotten it wrong is law enforcement agencies have really relegated it oftentimes to an afterthought. It was something that was compartmentalized into one section. One group of officers were responsible for doing that work, but it's every officer that goes out. They should embrace it. It should be a priority. It should be it should be a rating factor for their performance evaluations. It should be a factor for promotability in every aspect of policing. Community relations has to be at the core. And I think we've gotten it wrong. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful for is that we move out of that mindset that that's a function. It has to be something that is a part of the very DNA of agencies, that every officer knows that they are a community relations officer, that not only are they responsible for ensuring that there are good community relations, but in order to have good community relations, they have to be nurtured, just like any other relationship. You have to nurture them. You have to be invested at the very core of understanding what's going on in those communities, what's going on with the youth, what's going on with the seniors, what are the issues impacting quality of life. But I think our philosophy at USC, and Elizabeth, you know this because I built this around you and your understanding of this, is that it has to be something that our community members know that is just as much a priority as I'm trying to make it from inside. That those individuals, be they students, members of the community, business people, every aspect of the people that we're responsible for providing those services to, know that we're accessible, that we're mindful of what their concerns are. And I'll go back to something that Imada mentioned, two things: truth and reconciliation, and that has to be a part of where we meet them in the community, that we're willing to listen, and we're willing to be truthful, we're willing to be transparent, all of those things. So I think that, I'll be very critical of our profession and say that we have compartmentalized it as something, and we've allowed the officers that want to go out there and, I'll use the term, want to be gunfighters. We've allowed those officers to kind of define the narratives. And I will say this, in closing on this piece, departments get what they recruit. They get what they message their recruitment tactics around. And for many years, LAPD recruited along the line of almost parallel to the military. Be all that you can be, excitement. It was all driven toward, adrenaline and the car chases and all that. If you build your recruitment strategies around that, that's the kind of officer you're going to get. But if you build your recruitment strategies around community engagement, that a very important part of your job is to be about the community, because everybody talks about it in interviews. Everybody, when they first get hired by a police department, they talk about that like it's the only. They're actually afraid to talk about things like citations and arrests, which is an important part of the job too. But that somehow, some way, they veer off that path, and it becomes about two things that are antithesis of where we need to go. It becomes about them, and it becomes about putting bad guys in jail at all costs.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Chief.
That's all.
Something you said that resonated with me, because I told this story earlier this week to some recruits getting ready to go to the academy. We have an officer who was born in another country, and he remembers ending up in Glendale as a child, and his first positive contact with someone in a uniform, whether it be military or law enforcement, was a Glendale police officer who him and his father were going to get coffee. His father was going to get coffee, and the police officer opened the door for them. And that's, to me, the simplest way to know that everything you're doing out there is being watched, and you do not know how it's going to affect people. On that same line, Chief, what you just mentioned, in my class earlier this year, I showed them an academy video, and I said, based on this video, what do you see? What did you like? What's good? What's bad? And what's other? And the students talked about, this is just an action movie. This is Well, where's the academics in there? Where's the de-escalation in there? And yeah, so yeah, that's what we were recruiting, or that was the basis of that video. And yeah, you get what you get. As in law enforcement, for our future, we need to be contact professionals. Every contact means something, and there's a lot of people in this country, in this world, who don't deal with the police on a regular basis. So we can't afford to have a off day that day. This may be their one time they have a contact with the police department, and your off day is ruining their whole thought on law enforcement, if that's what it is. We really have to be professional when we're out there. It has to be consistent, and we got to do that every single day. And the majority of law enforcement is that. And I think those folks, again, need to be pushed to the front and respected for their position. The ethical standard is on us. We are the ones that raise our hand and take the oath, and it has to be respected in that way. And we have to look at that like we're the ones being paid to do this job. We have to be, the ethical standards is on us. I always give the example, no one cares if I do something and someone decides to curse me out, some member of the public decides to tell me all about my life and my family in a negative way. But the minute I turn that around on them, that's what the headline's going to be. And I can't put myself in that situation, and other officers can't do that either. And part of that's going to be diversity in hiring. Another example I gave this week to our new officers is, for example, diversity can mean a lot of things. And I hope we talk about that a little bit later today. But one of the examples I gave, if somebody was a waiter for 10 years, kept a job as a waiter for 10 years, do you think that person knows customer service? I would look at that applicant like interested in, if this person's now interested in being in law enforcement and wants to do the work to get there and get in it, absolutely. So I think, again, I hope we talk about diversity today, because it can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't, I think sometimes it's looked at just in one small funnel, and there's a lot of diversity out there that law enforcement needs going forward.
Sergeant Jackson, you mentioned this idea of officers and having off days, right? And I think that leads us into a question. And I just want to remind the viewers also that they can still text their questions. You should have a number on the screen. You can text us your questions there, and we'd be happy to ask that to our panelists. But in the interim, just on the topic of off days, I just want to know, what do you think our department should do to ensure the safety and wellness of our officers, which can oftentimes lead to some of those decisions or actions that our community members may view as questionable. So just, what can we do to ensure their safety and wellness, and how can we manage their stress and their mental health issues, officer burnout, things of that sort?
This is another subject of my class. Thank you, Dr. Shockman, for allowing me to get all my thoughts out in a classroom setting. We need to remove the stigma around just we're tough guys and girls and we can handle ourselves out there, and we see this bad stuff and we shake it off and we go home. That's not necessarily the case always. And I'm very happy that my department again has moved forward on some of these things, where we have an agency that we use, where if you get into an incident on duty, you will be required to, of course, go to see the psychiatrist before you come back. But we've also brought them in on an incident. There was an incident early this year, beginning of this year, where there was an accident where several officers, of course, are the first ones on scene. Someone died in this accident, and the next day the counselors were brought in to have that discussion. And if we can get that stigma out of there, that's going to be beneficial to the long-term health of our officers going forward. And I think, again, we don't have the benefit of having an off day. I have to compartmentalize, but that's not everybody that can do that. And as a young sergeant, I recall a senior sergeant kind of talking to me about different things about the job, and look for this when you're out there and look for that when you're out there. And we had a call where we, unfortunately, it was a baby not breathing call, which is, to me, the scariest call that I've ever gone on anytime that I've hear that call on the radio. And the baby didn't make it. And the officer had been providing CPR prior to the fire department arriving. And luckily, the sergeant had told me to look out for that. So I went to him immediately, and I could see that he was not there because he had felt, probably some guilt related to this incident that he couldn't do anything about. And of course, we made sure that he got proper counseling and got some time off to deal with that. But I don't know if that would have been the way that law enforcement would have handled that in the past. And I think it's really responsible on us especially in supervisory roles, to understand that our people, not everybody's the same. Some people have different needs with regard to that. But if we can get that stigma out of there and allow officers the ability to, and part of this program that we use, the officers, it is free for officers, their spouses, and their children to seek counseling if necessary, and it is not connected to their medical insurance, so no one in the building would know if they choose to use that. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to look forward to as far as providing those for officers, so that we can make sure that we have the long-term health for our officers going forward.
Hey, Liz, can I jump in and add to that, please?
Please.
Yeah, so I think wellness and well-being is critically important. Not only was it one of the pillars from the 21st Century Report on policing, but I'll give credit. I stole this from somebody much smarter than me, but it was said that this job will change you. The goal is not allow this job to break you, because oftentimes we do not see people on their best day. And to a couple of the examples that Sergeant Jackson just provided, we oftentimes are the first people there for these critical incidents and events. And so I think it's really incumbent upon law enforcement, executives to ensure that they have programs and systems in place within their organizations to address that particular issue. And then also a robust peer support program. Because as we all know, law enforcement is a unique culture onto itself. And one of the challenges that I've heard from other officers when it comes to seeking help from mental health professionals, if you don't have a mental health professional that understands police culture, it is oftentimes very difficult for the officer to first trust, but to establish a connection with that person such that they can share these thoughts and feelings. And so then that kind of parlays into the educational arena and getting more police psychologists trained. As I understand it, there's only a handful, maybe down in the Southern California area. Up in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm at now, there are only 2 certified police psychologists available. So I think that is an area, if any of the students are interested, in going the psychological route, that is an area where there is a tremendous need, not just for police officers, but for firefighters, EMTs, everybody that falls in that first response or first responder category. Because again, you have to talk about this. You have to get this stuff out in order for you to be healthy and to process, your emotions and your feelings. Because while when we put on, the uniform and the badge, we're seen as by some as less than human. We don't have feelings or emotions, and you have to compartmentalize. It takes a toll. And then we know, some of the tragic outcomes on the back end, be it, addiction, suicide, and those other things that can happen if a person does not have appropriate outlets, tools, and resources to deal with it.
Thank you, Chief Lowe. Chief Thomas and Chief Tingridis, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with everything that's been said. And I think officers see things that they cannot unsee. And they are interjecting themselves at some of the most vulnerable times in other individuals' lives. And some would say that it's not normal and that's repeated trauma time and time again. And so it is so important first for people to understand that we are human too. And employee wellness, if you don't have an officer that's well, it's going to transcend into them maybe doing a traffic stop where they're having an off day because that stress hasn't been addressed. So it is so critical, like Chief Lowe said, to ensure that employee wellness and those resources that are available to officers are utilized, and that there isn't a stigma associated with an officer realizing that they need those resources. And I wanted to touch back on something else that Chief Thomas had talked about as it relates to community policing. And I know that was a minute or so ago, but it has to start with leadership, and it has to be from the top down. And if you see a chief or a captain engaging in this relationship-based policing model, or a chief or a captain that's having, that's exercising and they're not afraid to talk about going to counseling. You have to role model what you expect of your subordinates. And so from community policing to taking care of yourself mentally, emotionally, and physically, all of that is a responsibility of the leadership within an organization, so that the younger officers that are coming on the job normalize that, and that's just the expectation.
You know, I will piggyback something that my good friend Daryl Lowe, Chief Lowe mentioned. When it comes to the wellness piece, it's, you know, there is a blueprint, you know, and I said not just for wellness, but for just where law enforcement needs to go. And he talked about the task force report on 21st century policing, and one of the pillars was wellness. But there's 6 other pillars that address a lot of other issues that are pertinent to where law enforcement needs to go. But when you start picking apart some of these tragedies in law enforcement, and George Floyd's murder was no exception, when you start looking at the officers that engaged in those behaviors, and particularly that resulted in his murder, and you pick any of these incidences, you start looking at it from the wellness perspective, you're going to find in each and every incident, officers said, yeah, I had some suspicions about him. Yeah, I saw him doing some things that probably, you know, he shouldn't have been doing. Yeah, he was coming to work a little wound tight, you know. So after the fact, the damage is done. George Floyd can't be undone, but probably if we had some systems in place to address stress, wellness, and officers engaging and having the courage and strength of character to say, yeah, you know, he's going down a bad path. I gotta not only protect him, I gotta protect our agency, I gotta protect our profession. But it starts with wellness. How an officer shows up to work is critical. You know, we're humans. You know, officers show up and, you know, they have had a bad day prior to getting to work, and they have nothing or have had nothing to change that. Guess what? There's a very good chance that that officer is going to do something that's probably going to be a manifestation of that built up stress. How do you not? How do you not? So the wellness piece is, again, just like community relations can be an afterthought, officer wellness cannot be an afterthought. It has to be a part of the very DNA of these agencies.
I agree. Thank you, Chief. I wanted to now get back to our bookmark on training, and talk about a little bit our police training, and how, or if that's changing at all, as a result of some of the demands over the course of this summer.
I would say it needs to. I think if we're ever going to get this thing right and get on the right track, it has to start at training. And I actually would prefer that the name of where what we call our basic training, it actually becomes more about education and critical thinking, because training is pretty rote. You know, we can, you know, we're trained to protect ourselves. We're trained to, you know, handle, you know, incidences involving force and deadly force and all that. What we don't get enough training in my opinion, is critical thinking, emotional intelligence, implicit biases, and those things like that, that actually are probably about a good 90+% of what police officers do. So I think that we need a wholesale transformation in how law enforcement education goes. And again, we also have to face some hard truths. Imada talked about it earlier, but law enforcement needs to come to grips with where it's rooted in American history. And we are rooted as a profession in the very core of American slavery. It's an institution that has not been addressed. Policing came and evolved from slave patrols. Yet nobody wants to talk about that, and people become very uncomfortable when you start talking about those very tough racial issues. And I will say this, and probably where I learned to become most comfortable about talking about race, Bill Bratton. Bill Bratton was our chief at LAPD, and Bill Bratton did not shy away from tough conversations about race. And Bill Bratton's a white guy. He's an Irish guy from Boston. And Bill Bratton got deep into the Black community in South LA and met with and listened to and had those very tough conversations about race. But I do believe that an important component of American policing, and Imada hit it on the head, culture, history, the history of law enforcement, the history of our agencies. Imada is only the second Black female in LAPD history to rise to the rank of deputy chief. And we hired our first Black female in 1916. LAPD hired its first Black officer in 1889. So these are some challenges, but none of it matters if we don't bring any more Black and people of color into the profession. Right now, we're at a critical junction because so few, Black people are coming into this profession that a lot of it is going to be undone. And I can almost say that for women, Asians. But by and large, these are some critical pieces to the training and the diversity that Sergeant Jackson talked about that have to be addressed when we talk about where do we go as far as the need for transformation in the American training model for police officers.
Thank you, Chief. And I just wanted to add real quick, for those of you wondering if Chief Thomas has like a prompter of sorts, no, he actually does know these dates.
Yeah, I'm a history nerd. I've done a lot of research on the history of Black LAPD, as Imada and Daryl and Elizabeth knows.
Yes, I just wanted to throw that out there. Chief does do a lot of research on the history of LAPD, so he definitely does know these things by heart. But Chief Tingrides, I think you have something to say.
Yeah, 100%, Chief Thomas, as it relates to the history and having these tough conversations. If we can't do it internally amongst each other and understand each other within an organization, how do you think that translates to the community? You're 100% correct on that. We just had our a law enforcement executive training 3 weeks ago, and our department brought in someone from Washington, D.C., and we had a whole 4-hour block on race. And these were, captains, chiefs, and deputy chiefs. And they went back to the 1800s and talking about slave patrols and traffic stops and chains and shackles and the meaning behind handcuffs. And you could feel the uncomfortableness amongst my peers in the room. And that is the first training in my almost 26 years where we really sat down and talked about the roots of where policing came from. And, it was almost a chilling effect in the room, and people were shifting in their seats, and some people were very uncomfortable, but it was much needed dialogue to have with our executive staff and holding each other accountable and saying, we need to know this matters. And there were people in the room whose parents could relate to some of those things, who are now police officers, that had an opportunity to say, no, this is true. And this is how I relate to some of it. And this is why I became a police officer. And those are tough discussions to have. But when we can be true with ourselves and have that dialogue, we're going to better serve the community with that knowledge that we have.
Thank you, Chief. And just before I forget, you can still continue to text your questions to the phone number on the screen. And one of the things that I was going to touch on as Chief Thomas and Chief Tingrides were responding to the last question was the idea of diversity, right, and continued recruitment. We no matter what happens, right, whether defunding happens or not, we will always need police officers, and we will always need to continue to do some of our best recruitment. Again, going back to what I said earlier, I thought no one ever wanted to be a police officer ever again, right, after this year. I'm just curious on some of the audience members that do want to join law enforcement and be police officers. I'm really curious about what motivates them, right? And then I think, again, they're such an inspiration to us to know that despite everything that they're seeing, that they're still pursuing a degree to become not only police officers, but the absolute best police officers that they can be. I personally am very curious about what are some of those motivators. Maybe we can get a little bit into the diversity and some of the recruitment strategies, our recruitment efforts, and some of the roadblocks that we're running into when it comes to recruitment and attempting to diversify some of our departments. I don't know if maybe with you, Chief Ingridis and Chief Lo, if you guys wanted to get us started on that particular question.
Liz, I was about a year or so ago, I was at a homicide scene where a special needs individual was walking down the street, and he had headphones on, and a car pulled up, and they basically executed this poor kid. And he ended up landing in the middle of the street, and there was a daycare center just a block away from where that incident happened. And it was right around the time that school was getting let out. So we not only had to worry about, protecting the scene, but ensuring that these young kids that were getting out of school didn't walk past that scene. And some family members that showed up, and the tensions were getting high. And I remember the officers getting out of their cars, and some of them had grabbed their batons because these large groups were running over. And this gentleman, an African-American, came up to me, and he's yelling, and he says, "I want to know why none of those officers down there that are responding to this look like me or look like you. And, all you cops just come to our community and you criminalize and you suppress us." And he was very angry. And I remember sitting back and taking a deep breath, like Victor said, you've got to take it. And I let him finish. And I looked at him and I said, well, it starts with you. You need to stop telling the community to hate us. And you need to stop criminalizing us and being negative about us. Because if I live in this community and all I'm hearing is this negativity, there's no way I'm going to be motivated to become a police officer when there isn't that respect there. And so I'm not saying that it's only the community's responsibility. It's got to be respect on both sides. But once that anger in communities of color, specifically the Black community, who's very angry right now, once you can work through that anger, and Chief Thomas also talked about it, the truth and reconciliation, then more people of color are going to feel more comfortable making the decision to become a police officer and give back to their community and change perspectives in their community. So I think it's critical that we role model. I was walking a footbeat in Nickerson Gardens a couple weeks ago, and there was a group of Black individuals hanging out, and one of them said, "Damn, I ain't never seen a Black chief before." And they were whistling and "You go, girl," and they were shocked to see me in a uniform, in a position like that, and they were proud. And just having that role model and being able to have that conversation with them and talk to them and understand the shock that they had really made me realize we have so much more work to do, but how critical my role is to be out in the community and show that it is possible. And so we have a lot of work to do in that arena.
And thank you, Chief Ingridis. And I know Chief Lo has a few comments, but I just wanted to repeat one of the things that you said that I think a few years ago, and Chief Thomas would agree, we would have never heard. I just heard you say, "I was walking a footbeat the other day in Nickerson Gardens." Right? And for those of us who are from South LA, we know that in and of itself speaks volumes of the work that the LAPD is doing, the work that you're doing. And although we have such a long way to go, how far along we've come. So the other day I was hooking up at bait in the River Garden. That is an incredible thing to do.
As opposed to my generation, we're requesting backup in this.
So truly times have in fact changed. If I could, I want to go back and just add a couple comments to the previous conversation we were having in regards to the history of law enforcement and the like, and I'll share just a real brief story. I just went through a promotional process in my organization, and I had a conversation with a white officer that was looking to promote to sergeant. And we were having a conversation about current events and things, and he shared something with me that I thought was very insightful and reflective on his part. He shared the fact that he came from a small town in Idaho, and he says, you know, Chief, he goes, I've probably been around racist people. He goes, but I've never heard anybody explicitly say racist things. He goes, where I came from, he goes, there was no diversity. He goes, so there were no conversations in regards to race or anything. He goes, but he realized that where his growth opportunity and his areas for development were, he goes, clearly these things are happening to other people. So I need to understand, you know, these things that have occurred and understand where they're coming from so I can better serve them. And I think that as we talk about these different conversations, and as uncomfortable as it is, both for Blacks and for whites, is that if people come into it with the mindset of understanding the other person's perspective, I think we will make progress there, because we know it's difficult. It's a difficult conversation. We know it's uncomfortable. So we have to acknowledge that and get the folks that may not have had the experiences that we have had as people of color, as people of color in law enforcement, just to get them to understand the shoes in which we walk, to provide them better context and perspective. And to Chief Thomas's point, when we start talking about, you know, implicit bias and procedural justice and those types of things, we have to look at the critical race theory as well, so we have a true understanding, of American society, and understand, you know, these parts and pieces of it. And I think that's a great place to start. And then that transitions into the recruitment aspect and the diversity part. And I'll rib Chief Thomas a little bit here. If you steal my ideas, I want my percentage back. And what it really comes down to is we have to go to the places. Yeah. We have to go to the places where the people that we're looking for operate. So when I went up to the Pacific Northwest, I go, okay, let's not just do the standard recruitment thing at the testing company that we've done for the last 10 years. If we're looking for diversity, okay, let's look, and you can appreciate this, Chief, coming from a college department. Let's go to the colleges and universities. If we're looking for, for female recruits, let's go look at some of the female sports tournaments. Okay, because we all know if you can maintain eligibility in the NCAA, you can pass a background check, right? So let's look to that. And you have teamwork. You have those character traits that we're looking for. Let's go specifically to the minority communities. Let's look to those minority newspapers or websites, those different things. If those are the specific groups that we're looking for, but then let's take it a little bit deeper to Chief Tingaridi's comment, when you have those naysayers within the community, it's like, okay, stop throwing daggers. How can you come alongside of us and help in this process? And I'll give odes to one of my former chiefs, and some of you guys may recognize her, but I thought Jackie Seabrooks, when she was in the city of Inglewood, she did something that turned a lot of heads, but I thought was very insightful. She went out and took one of the biggest voices in the community that was anti-police, and brought him into the fold, made him part of the community panels for promotion and the like. It's like, okay, if you're gonna sit there and squawk, well, how about you come help us change, since if you think you have the answers. But that also provides a perspective. It provides that community perspective. And if that person has credibility within the community, now if they're part of it, it becomes a bit harder to throw stones when you sat across the table and you said that person was ready for promotion. So I think those are some of the steps that we can take, and that law enforcement executives can take as we look to make these transformations.
If I can jump in, I think that as was discussed in the Woodbury University Public Safety Administration course 3705 in policing, I happen to know someone in charge of that class. You have to start with the history, because in order to understand what's happening today, you have to base it on the history. And if people don't know the history, they don't understand why people are so angry today. So the very first discussion we had in the class, I talked about slave patrols and what law enforcement role was in there, and Jim Crow laws and voting rights and anti-war protests, and how we handled poorly law enforcement, all of those things, and how that has had a lasting effect on what we're dealing with today. But if you don't understand that, and there were students, of course, in my class that had never heard those things, and I'm great, that was the point. But we can't talk about, you may not understand this full picture that's happening over here if you don't understand that and how it has resonated and carried on, and talked about how the history of this country was poor to immigrants a lot, and law enforcement, again, having a role in that. You have to understand all those pieces to get you to today and what you need to do. I think that Chief Thomas talked about starting with the academy. I'm going to speak on behalf of all of our chiefs here, and also you need the right chief at the right time. You need to give them time to implement change, because change is difficult, because not everybody is in it for the same reasons, and not everyone sees the need for the change. So we have to educate our current officers and make sure they're there, bring our new officers up, but then let that leadership come down. A lot of our officers and administrators, they train leadership, but then they don't act leadership. It has to be one thing. And we have known, law enforcement has known what's necessary for decades, but they have not been willing to make those changes. Why? Because we don't like being told what to do, for one, right? The community has not demanded it in the way that they're demanding it now. So now this can be a turning point, like there have been these turning points in history. And if we can move forward, if in 1968, the Commission on Lyndon Johnson commissioned a study about law enforcement disorder, and the things he talked about were taking officers back to the community, like the chief was out there walking a footbeat. You have to decentralize law enforcement. You have to put the officers out there in the community. You have to hire minorities. Whoa, you have to educate the officers. Whoa, like these are all things that we're talking about today, and they're looked at as kind of a radical thing. These were things were known in 1968, but again, there was not necessarily the same community demand. And law enforcement, we're doing pretty good. I think sometimes in law enforcement, one of our biggest things that we do poorly is when we hear change, we hear you did it wrong. You were doing it wrong. So someone who's had a tenure, and even a respectful tenure, they've been doing the right thing for 20 years, 30 years, they hear change, in their head, they hear, I've been doing it wrong. No, we just can do it better. And if we can make sure that our officers inside know that, then we can expand. And going back to something you asked a little bit earlier, Elizabeth, you asked, why are these folks doing it today? Based on my students in my course and the new officers that I teach and train, it's the same reasons that Chief Thomas got into it back in Chief Lowe, all the way back. They want to make a change. They want to make a difference. They're not scared by all of this other stuff around, because they look at it and say, I could be the one to make that change. I want to be a part of that change. And here's this moment in time. And if we don't take advantage of it, we'll be talking about this again in another 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it is. So now's the time. Now's the time. We have the public certainly has the desire for change. We internally want the change. So let's do it. And let's bring these new officers up, and let's let these chiefs have opportunities, and give them the ability to make changes internally if they face roadblocks. Because sometimes, unfortunately, believe it or not, the chief cannot make the changes they want to, because they're held by city council or some other outside entity that won't allow them to make the changes because they don't understand the inner workings of the department. The chiefs know what's going on in their department. They know how to make those changes, but you have to give them the time and the ability to do it.
In just a matter of time, it will be Chief Victor Jackson.
If Dr. Shockman has anything to do with it, I promise you that'll happen. Thank you.
And I hate to break it to you, but you're about to be like the second best class at Woodbury. I'm going to start teaching there pretty soon. So enjoy the place while you can, because it's going to last you about 2.5 more months.
All right, I can handle that.
So on this topic of new and incoming officers, and you, Sergeant Jackson, being at the academy level and the training level, but also our 3 other panelists being at the chief level, We do have some people that are watching that are, again, hoping to join law enforcement and be police officers. And I'm curious to know, knowing what we know now and being where we are now, what are you looking for in these people that want to become police officers? And what can they do now to be the very best applicants?
Go ahead. Okay. I think first, I want to say that you can do it. And all of us, Victor, Chief Thomas, Chief Lowe, we all started as intimidated. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I was. When I stood on the black line in the academy, I was intimidated. Number one, there were very few females. There were very, very few female Blacks. I'd never been in a physical fight before. I'd never held a firearm before. I was intimidated by the male dominant class. It is a challenge, but I'm here to tell you that you can do it. And you can start off and graduate the academy and become a police officer. And what you need to take with you is the compassion to want to serve the community and to do it respectfully. And it is a profession that will do more for you than what you do for the community. It will make you be grateful for what you have, better serve your own families, and help you gain an understanding of what it's like to be in dark places and the most highest places. It is a career that allows you to get to know people, to save people's lives, to make a difference in people's lives. And it's truly a calling. It is one of the best professions you can have and be a part of. Don't be afraid. Take it head on. Remember that you serve the people, and in turn, the people will serve you, and it will become a partnership where you can make a difference in the community. I also would like to say that we're looking for people who know how to understand other people, who have empathy and emotional intelligence. We're not looking for just that ex-military person because he runs the fastest or was involved in combat. We're looking for people that come from the community. We're looking for people that understand the community. We're looking for people from single homes that grew up in foster care, people that really know the community and understand what it's like to be part of the community. You need a high school diploma or GED. Don't be intimidated and feel like you have to come in with a master's degree. What's most important, the biggest tool you have is your heart and your endurance to never give up and to not have fear. I think that if we spend time talking about the total person and what it takes to be a good police officer, we can have candidates from across this country that want to get into this work because it is so fulfilling.
Yeah, I think you talk about what we discussed. If you want to be a part of change, if you want to help your community and the community around you, then we want you. And it doesn't have to be. I talked about when I got hired, I had 30-some units, and now I have my master's. I had no idea I was ever going to get into education and be teaching a class when I became a police officer. And I didn't, and you don't know the path, and be open to change. In my head, I'm gonna get hired by the Glendale Police Department. I'm gonna be I'm gonna work patrol. I'm gonna be an assault detective, robbery, homicide. Don't call my name anymore. I'm gonna have my robbery, homicide. I never made it to assaults. Never made it to robbery, homicide. Went a whole different path, and which led me to being a field training, being a background investigator, which made me want to invest in our new officers, and then a field training officer, and then a drill instructor, and then having the opportunity to fall into this role. If you that open heart, that willingness to do good in the community, that's who we want. Now, for us, who are we targeted? We should be doing some targeted recruitment, absolutely, because no matter what we say, there are things that we should be attracted to. For example, we need to, this has been a male-dominated, right, Chief? This has been a male-dominated profession for a long time. We need to do targeted recruitment for women. There's no question about that. But we can also do other things. And when I mentioned it a little bit earlier, when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about I guess sometimes when people hear diversity, they hear anti-white, and I want to be real clear about that. That's not necessarily the case. Well, that's not the case. What I'm saying is other, different kinds. We want all different kinds of people because that's going to bring us all have the ability to learn. And that's what we should be doing in this job. We should be learning from the community every day. But if you already have a base of knowledge because you've lived and worked in the community, that's someone who we want. I think there's a diversity in age. I think having hiring a 21-year-old is fantastic. Hiring a 30-year-old is fantastic. A 40-year-old is fantastic. All of that. Students, having your degree is fantastic. And it's great. If you have a public safety background, that's fantastic. If you have a sociology background, psychology, I look at a degree as you chose to follow a path. You said, I'm going to do this thing, and I accomplished it. I don't care what your degree is in. I want you. You said I'm fixing myself to do this thing, and I'm going to do it. That's the kind of person I think we want in law enforcement. If you had a military background, yeah, come on. Okay. We can teach you and train you too. You've had a career of work experience. Again, I gave the example of someone who was a waiter. Bring that. Let's go. Let's bring all these things to the table, and let's all work together and figure out learn from our own experiences. And from a supervisor level, let's listen to these folks as things come up, because everybody brings a wealth of experience, and let's see what they have, what their perspective is, or what their knowledge is, and how we can all get better. If we're all looking at it again from the perspective of we can do a little better, then we can do better for sure.
I'm going to take a different path on this because I do believe I agree with everything that both Victor and Imada mentioned, but I think at the core of when you talk about diversity and we talk about the future of a diverse law enforcement, we've got to get at the crux of why little Black boys and little Latinx boys somehow get off the path to not only not being eligible to be police officers, but lead lives of destruction. And I think that's the crux of it, because I think in all of my career work in South LA and East LA and places that I worked, I never came across a little boy that said, I want to go to prison. I want to be, caught up into the system. They've all said, I want to be a police officer. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a firefighter. And somehow, some way, around 3rd, 4th grade, they're caught up. I think, we can't even begin to have this conversation about what we want to recruit until we improve the life chances of the very people we're trying to recruit, because that's a very complex issue. And it's an issue larger than law enforcement, but we have a role. And I look at some of the programs, and Ahmad, I'm gonna keep putting you on the spot because of the work that you've done. I look at the work that's being done in the housing developments. I look at, the Watts Rams and the things that are done specifically to ensure, because Daryl's experience is like mine. I grew up large single family on welfare, my mom out of the South. I was not supposed to join LAPD. I grew up in the midst of gangs. I grew up, the Crips started in my neighborhood. I knew Raymond Washington when I was a kid. So I wasn't supposed to. And the hardest part for me coming on LAPD was my background. Not that I'd ever committed a crime. I was straight out of UCLA. But my background investigator kept focusing on, well, how could you grow up in this neighborhood and know these people and still not be an associate of gangs? It's easy. Focus on where I'm at right now. I'm a senior at UCLA. But that never came up. It was all about South LA. So before we can start talking about and having an intelligent conversation about what we want to do to diversify, we got two major populations, male Black, male Latinx, that are on paths that most of them are not going to be even qualified to be police officers. So we got to get at the programs, and I think there's a role we can play as police officers in the community engagement and the investment. But it's a lot more complex than just, we're going to recruit a certain type, because I am not supposed to be where I'm at. I am not, and it was only by the grace of God and the grace of people investing in me that resulted in me being where I'm at. But I am, not special. I'm not, but I was I knew a lot of guys like me, much smarter, much more capable, but they went down a path that they got caught up into the system and there was nothing in place to catch them. So I think that's an important role that we have to embrace as Black and minority officers. But it's something that when you talk about institutional racism, you got to address that too, because I am, as someone who has studied the history of law enforcement in the city of LA and the county of LA, we can look around in 5-10 years and there won't be an Imada Tingarides or a Daryl Lowe or a Victor Jackson if we're not cognizant about recruiting others that look like us, and not only recruiting them, but undergirding them before they get caught up into the system so that they don't. So that's my contribution to what we need to do to ensure, diversity.
I have a theory on that, Chief Thomas. Let me get your thoughts on it. There are so many officers at my department, me included, who were affected positively by the DARE program.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being excited when that officer came into my school, and that's something. How do you get that? But if, as a chief, as you guys are, you may not see the results of that output of funds for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of investment it's a lot that goes into this. So how do you deal with that? How do you get your city council or whoever your governing body is that holds the purse to understand that you may not see the results of this today? It's a whole piece. It's a whole thing, and it has to be kind of a whole community effort. And it's not just like we talked about the top down from the police department, where it starts at the chief and works our way down to our recruiting. Same thing in the community, right? We can start with the OGs. We can work with the old heads and get them some understanding about what law enforcement does and listen to them and hear them out. We got to get those kids too. Right. But if we don't make that, you may not see the results of that for 20 years. And how do we get that across as well?
I'll say I don't have 20 years. And I'll say that I'm blessed because USC does not. Elizabeth will tell you the majority of our department is Black and Latinx. The minority in the USC Department of Public Safety is male white. The majority of our officers are not only Black and Latino, but the majority of them are like Liz and I, come from the community surrounding us. So it's a matter of what is the priority of that chief, and where does that chief choose to focus their recruitment efforts? And not only that, who are they developing within? It starts at the youth portion for us. We have a very robust cadet program that Elizabeth oversees. But she'll tell you, our focus is not so much to make them police officers. Our focus is to make them first generation college students. Now, if they want to become officers after that, that's okay. But you have to begin to invest and you have to begin to shape what your priorities as a chief are. Because I think a lot of chiefs hide behind what I can't do. And I remember, having a conversation with then Chief Beck, and I remember standing with him at a graduation, and I looked across the graduating class and I saw that there was only like 3 African Americans, and 3 of them were mine. There were 6 total. And I said, what's up with this? And he says, well, JT, we're having a hard time recruiting. And I'm like, well, I'm not, so I think it's, because again, you start peeling back the layers of why people are not getting through the process, and you start finding people that look like me and have my experiences. I never committed a crime, never had any interactions that would prevent me from, but I had a background investigator who was focusing on where I grew up. And if I hadn't fought that, and actually if it hadn't been for somebody inside LAPD that didn't know me that I went to, and that was Bernard Parks, and I called him and I said, this is what's going on. And he says, I know exactly what's going on. Expect to hear from the department in 2 days. And 2 days later, I get a call and they offered me a position in the department. But I really, truly believe that if he hadn't interceded on my behalf, I'd have never gotten onto LAPD. So we also have to do some work to help ensure, once we know that these barriers exist, we have to be the ones that cut through them, because like I said, you can, I am a couple of decisions and mistakes away from being caught up myself. As opposed to sitting in front of you and saying I'm a chief, I could very well be sitting somewhere wondering, how did my life get to this point, and why can't I be successful? So I look at it from the perspective of we have work to do, but we got work to do prior to in our communities to ensure that there's others that look like us in this profession in the future.
Chief Lowe,
So I
did you
think
want to?
one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Marty. So to Sergeant Jackson's question and point is how do you invest in something that may not produce dividends or return on your investment for quite some time? I think it kind of goes back to Chief Thomas's early point and kind of the overarching crux of this conversation. It's about being one with the community. And to Chief Thomas's point, if we can have our officers, us as chiefs or executives, participate in mentoring programs, be it the DARE program, be it PAL programs, Boys and Girls Clubs, those types of things, so that they see officers in other circumstances and situations. In Santa Monica, we had a DARE program, and a number of officers say they remembered their DARE officer. I remember my DARE officer. So I think it's those types of things that we do, knowing that it's not going to be an immediate return on investment, but that's part of that larger community that we are talking about, that we say we stand behind. So we have to take those substantive steps and participate in these programs, and then that will help on the back end of hopefully when that young man or young woman is faced with that decision, hopefully they'll hear that their DARE officer, they'll hear that mentor in back of their head saying, hey, that's probably not the right path, to take. And then looking at, what do you want on the back end? As they say, it takes all kinds. Amada's point of, people that have been part of the system, people that understand it, to understand these different aspects. Not everybody, and I participated in a panel about a week ago, speaking around background investigations, and I told them, I go, you have to be careful of the perfect applicant. Because the person that has zero life experience, is that really the person that you want to equip with a badge and a gun to go out there? And not saying that because a person like Chief Thomas, who never committed a crime or did anything wrong, growing up, it takes all kinds. And then the other piece, to Liz and the technical folks, if I could get Chief Tingaridi's comment about the recruitment piece, I'm going to use that. That was the perfect lead in. I don't think I could add anything to it. From your experience and what it is that we're looking for, in applicants and recruits to police departments.
Yeah, Daryl, you spot on. Victor, those are the words chiefs of police should be saying. You cannot be afraid to think outside of the box. When you're an executive leader, that's what you need to do to make change. You're talking about organizations that have been 150 years in existence who said this is just how we always do it. You can't be afraid to say that's how we've always done it, but we're about to change it. And I can remember being at a public safety hearing meeting about 8 or 9 years ago. We had just started, I had taken officers out of uniform and allowed them to go to 99th Street Elementary School and read on Fridays. And we had started that program in honor of Randy Simmons, who was a SWAT officer that was killed. And Randy was going into the community, no fanfare, with the glory kids and picking kids up and taking them to church. And he almost, didn't even want to tell anybody in the LAPD because that he would have been thought of as weak, or we don't do that. And so we had started this reading program, and we had put kids inside of the schools. And when we first went on campus, the kids were running away from us. They're going to arrest us. They're going to arrest us. We're scared. And so we said, well, we're going to keep coming back. And at that time, people were laughing at me. I was just a sergeant in charge of a community relations unit. They told me, you're not social workers. That's what school police is for. And I remember meeting with the principal, and the principal saying, I don't know what else to do. We need you. I'm open to this. And the more we kept going back on Fridays, we started building relationship with those third and fourth graders. And then those third and fourth graders started telling us that, you know, their brothers were in a gang, or their brother came home the other night and hid a gun in a closet. They wanted us to go to the house and get the gun out of the closet because they didn't want something to happen to their brother. And then we started building the relationships with the families. And then the family started asking, how do I get graffiti removed? I need to get my alley cleaned up. And so, but that took years and it was exhausting. But the end result was a reduction in crime and relationships built. And some of those kids that we started working with in third, fourth, fifth grade, some of them now are in college, and they still to this day talk about that reading program and how their life was changed and how grateful they were that we took that time. So here we are 10 years later with this CSP program, where the LAPD is finally looking at it as not an experiment, but a culture shift in how we should be policing. It's like changing a submarine, right? It takes forever to do that. So as a leader, you can't be afraid to take the rocks and bottles and people make fun of you and the type of policing that you're doing. If it's saving a life, then it is our job. And no, if it means that I'm a social worker with a gun, that I'm a social worker with a gun. It's everybody's responsibility to take that time to change a life and to make a difference in someone's life.
Thank you so much, Chief. And that reminds me, you know, when I started working community relations under Chief Thomas, whom for whatever reason that I will never understand, he trusted me to lead that unit. I remember having absolutely no idea where to start. Because even though we're a university, we also offer services and we like to serve the community that lives around the university. And I remember, you know, thinking, what do I do? So of course, I went to my mom and I asked my mom. I said, Mom, I don't know how to do this job. I'm not sure why they let me have it. And she says, if you're going to do community relations, she says, I just want to remind you of one thing. And Chief Thomas knows this one all too well. She said, it starts with the kids. And I said, why? And I will never forget, she said, people may forget what you do for them, but they will never forget what you do for their kids. And I just keep hearing that, you know, as he talked DARE, as he talked, you know, reading programs, as, you know, these sport programs, it all, yes, it does target kids, but, you know, ultimately that's where we want to invest, right? Even if it takes 10, 15, 20 years for us to see that investment, but investing in our kids, we're also investing in, you know, broader relationships, because people don't forget that. So I just wanted to thank you for your answers. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Dr. Shockman, for you know, allowing us to put this together. And you know, to the IT, there's a lot of people in the background helping, because you know, we may know community relations and we may know academics and we may know policing, but we do not know IT. So thank you to all of the people in the background helping us make this happen, and of course to the people who tuned in. And you know, one of the you know, just to kind of end this and then hand it over back to Dr. Shockman, I just wanted to say one of the things that really stuck out a couple of times from all of you was, you know, the community's responsibility and their role in decreasing some of the tensions between the community and law enforcement. You know, and of course, law enforcement, it's also our job, but it's not only our job. So again, thank you to each and every single one of you. And Dr. Shockman, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. So I think we owe Elizabeth a round of applause for doing an amazing job. And yes, and before we all came on, she said she was having butterflies or afraid. You wouldn't know this woman is afraid of anything, right? Fearless is how I would define her. So for the panelists, thank you on behalf of our students, our faculty, the community. Each one of you are change agents. You have passion. You've shown all of that today. And your thoughtfulness was another takeaway for me as an academic to really sort of, do the deep think that many of you have talked about, the notion
Keep
of,
going.
I'm sorry? Oop. I'm sorry. The notion of critical thinking, the notion of emotional intelligence, that's what we're teaching our students, because that's the critical peel off of what they really need to address and be different out in the field. Lastly, let me just pick up on one last thought that Chief Thomas mentioned about this is a global issue. This truly is a global issue. It is not just about you all sort of addressing localism and sort of the things happening in our communities. This is happening around the world. We are all in the same boat looking at the social manifestation of change and how that sort of impacts all our communities. And to the last point about reconciliation, I just finished a book on peace, reconciliation, and social justice, and it is a global issue. And part of what I think we can learn is from other communities who've really gone through the reconciliation process, have really owned up to their history, have really sought a truth and reconciliation path. And that to me is really what we haven't done as a community, as a nation, as policing entities. We need to take some leadership in really demanding our leaders, and I'm talking about our political leaders, really move us in that direction. So with that as a long-winded ending, let me again, from the bottom of my heart and Dean Ellis's heart, thank you all for your time and your commitment and what you do in the field. So this will be recorded, and I'm sure many other of our community people and students will avail themselves to it. So thank you all. And as far as the wellness part, go now and have a better afternoon in your own your own world, so that you can be better and well for your family and for the rest of the community. Thank you. Go in peace.
Thank you.
Be well. Bye-bye.